Okay, it's Mary Hood again. Once again, I'm coming to you live, and I think I fixed the glitch. Turns out all I really needed to do was download Firefox. My other browser wasn't working anymore with it. But at any rate, so I'm here again, and today we're talking about dealing with naysayers. You know, when you make a decision to do something like homeschooling, which is a little out in left field. When I did it, it was really a very unusual thing to do. Nowadays, it's much more common, but there are still people who are going to think you're doing the wrong thing for your kids. All right, so you need to learn how to deal with them. Um, I've divided this talk today up into different types of people that you're going to be running into in your daily life. The very first one is the antagonistic person, the person who really isn't all that interested in why you homeschool or whether homeschooling is okay. They're often insecure themselves and possibly even trying to justify their rationale of not homeschooling and so forth. You know the type, and I'm going to use the same issue, which is socialization, with each one of these so you can begin to spot which type of person you're dealing with. So this is the person that comes up to you, maybe at a ball game or something, or a park, and maybe even a little stereotypical, but maybe he has a beer can in his hand or something, and says, "You're homeschooling, your kids are never going to get socialized. Might as well just raise them in a closet," or something. This is the antagonistic person who really is not interested, all right? And you have two jobs right now, and one is not to let yourself get riled up by this person, and the other one is to make sure that your kids aren't being hurt by whatever it is this person is saying to you. All right, what you do not do with this kind of person is engage at all. You don't say one thing about socialization. You don't start discussing your co-ops, or anything like that. You don't discuss at all. All right, what you do is have this water off a duck's back. I'm going to use that several times today, but this in particular, to not let it rile you at all. Smile sweetly if you can stand to. If not, give them a stony glare or something in between, and say something very simple like, "Well, thank you, I appreciate your concern." That's it. Don't engage, don't discuss. That kind of person, you cannot win that discussion, and all you're going to do is make yourself get riled up. If this is being done in front of your children, if at all possible, move, leave if necessary, even if it's inconvenient. You don't want them subjected to this kind of thing, especially if they start directing the comments to the children themselves. So that's person number one. Pretty much ignore them, all right? And try not to let them rile you up. Okay, the second type is the person who probably is entrenched in public education, possibly a teacher, possibly somebody who's got their kids in public school. You don't think there's much chance at all that they're really interested in homeschooling, but they seem genuinely curious. So they'd be the one that would come up to you and say, "You're homeschooling this year? That really surprises me. Aren't you concerned about socialization?" All right, and of course there are other things they could say too. I'm just using this as a very typical example over and over right now so you can see the difference in how they approach you. All right, this is the kind of person you give short, simple answers to. All right, and keep in mind, you never know when that person may wind up homeschooling in a few years, even if you thought there was no chance at all right now. For example, again, what about socialization? This is the person you say, "Oh, you'd be surprised. We have so many opportunities out there. We have various co-ops and outside classes," and then kind of, again, in a lighthearted way, "Sometimes I feel like we don't even spend enough time at home these days." Again, short, simple, but you give them an answer, right? And just enough of an answer to get them to think just a little bit. Because again, later on, that might have one of the most against homeschooling people I ever talked to in my life was a professor of mine when I was taking my PhD classes, and 5 years later they were homeschooling and asking me for advice. So you just never know when someone can shift out of that category. But again, short, polite, nice, but don't go into a great deal of detail with that kind of person. The third one is somebody that you think actually might be asking you questions because they're interested in considering it a little bit, all right? This is the person you want to engage with a little more. This is the person you want to tell about the co-ops and about the local homeschooling group that they connect with over at the public library, and you could tell them things about the old Schoolhouse magazine having digital copies, back copies you can read online for free. This is the kind of person that I usually keep one or two books in my car to share with them if they wanted to. This is my newest one, The Relaxed Homeschooler Rides Again, which is available on Amazon either as a real book or as an ebook. All right. People used to often give my book, The Relaxed Homeschool, away. Several people would buy 5 copies at a time just to give them away. Now, usually what I do is write my name, please return to Mary Hood, knowing darn well they're not going to. As somebody that ran a homeschool library, I know that's very unusual for you to get those books back. But if you can afford to keep 2 or 3 books in your car for this kind of person, somebody that you really, and always ask them first. Don't just hand them a book. Ask them, if you're really interested, I could give you something, that you might like to read or whatever. But polite, fully answering your questions, engaging with the person in this case, but not thinking it's your job to talk them into homeschooling. It's not at all. And be careful not to criticize public school while you're doing it, all right? Because right now their kids are in public school, and you wouldn't like it if they came up to you and criticized your choices. So don't start being critical of public school. Just emphasize some of the good things, the positive things you're seeing about homeschooling. If this happens to be one of these people that has been homeschooling, as a public school person bringing the public school home, be sure to very in a again lighthearted, quick way, tell them that that's not really what homeschooling is like. That we don't just sit home at all the time and do this, and that we set our own goals and we don't have to follow someone else's schedule and all that sort of thing, because you do want them to realize that there are other ways of doing it, right? So those are the 3 essentially relatively stranger situations that you run into. The super antagonistic one, water off a duck's back, smile politely or give them a stony glare, don't engage at all. All right, get your kids out of there if it's a problem. All right. The second one, mildly interested, pretty entrenched in public school, short, simple answers, just enough to get them maybe a spark of interest. And then the third one, the one that might actually be interested, and you ask them, engage enough to determine if there really is some interest, and then ask them, essentially for permission to give them a book or suggest something that they might be able to go see. Obviously, the more knowledgeable you are about this, the better you can answer their questions. For example, if they're asking questions about the legal status in your state, so that you have various places you can send them. You can always start by sending somebody to hslda.org, Homeschool Legal Defense Association, but you should never stop there. You should always go to the local people, because their explanations are pretty surface, and obviously they can't keep up with everything all the time if there's little changes or nuances or how the local people do things. All right. Okay. Now we get into people who are not strangers or casual acquaintances. We're going to start with talking about neighbors. The number one thing is, if you have a neighbor who is definitely opposed to your homeschooling and makes that very clear, this is a time to consider joining at least Homeschool Legal Defense, hslda.org. All right. They are an organization that have helped a lot of people over the years. They're a little controversial. Some people love them, some people don't necessarily. And I don't recommend them in all cases, but when you have a negative neighbor situation, you want to be able to call up a lawyer. So unless you have your own lawyer that you can afford, it's nice to be able to just call somebody up if somebody ever shows up on your doorstep criticizing you. And again, if you have negative neighbors, that's one time I do recommend that people join that organization. Now, as far as the negative neighbors go, again, I can sort them into three types, really. One is, again, the antagonistic negative neighbor, but not necessarily dangerous, all right? This is the one that's, constantly little snide remarks about homeschooling, aren't your kids in school yet? Aren't you afraid they're gonna, whatever, you know what I'm talking about, the antagonistic one, but the one that doesn't strike you as somebody who's going to go report you somewhere. All right. That, again, you kind of go back to number 1 and 2, except that this is not a stranger you're just passing the street. It's somebody that you live next to all the time. So you don't want to do the stony glare approach. You want to use the friendly, very short answers, try not to engage too much in the subject, all right, that kind of thing. Now then you come to the dangerous neighbor. All right. And by dangerous, I mean somebody who might really try to get you in trouble. This is not always uh, the beer carrying antagonistic one. This might be someone who's on the school board, a public school teacher, a grandmother whose kids are in public school, somebody like that, somebody who genuinely cares about your kids a little bit and thinks you're doing the wrong thing by them and might just report you. All right. If you have a situation like that, definitely join Homeschool Legal Defense or have your own lawyer if you'd prefer. Some people also go with something called the Rutherford Institute, which isn't as well known, but it also does similar things to what HSLDA does. And then the other thing is, this is a case where you want to keep very good records of what you're doing, all right? Especially if you're a bit of a relaxed homeschooler. I've talked about record keeping elsewhere, but be able to articulate what your goals are. If you're not doing certain things, why aren't you? Maybe it's a readiness issue or something. What are you doing? And all that sort of thing. And try to keep a relatively regular schedule, especially if you've got a kind of Mrs. Kravitz situation. Remember that from Bewitched, where somebody's just looking out the window all the time, checking to see what your kids are up to. All right. Try to have them go outside at sort of regular scheduled times so you can almost refer to it as recess if you need to. So they're not just hanging around out in the yard all day long when it's supposed to be a school day and so forth. And then the third one is someone who maybe isn't real positive about homeschooling, but is a nice person, and you're not at all concerned that they're going to turn you in or anything, and they're not really being antagonistic. This is the person to try to use as a resource. Little kids need extra grandparents sometimes, or, to go talk to somebody who's a Vietnam War veteran and learn about that, or maybe learn about gardening if they're into gardening and you're not. I had a neighbor, his name was Mr. Slater, many, many years ago when I was a child, and I used to hang around his house all the time, and he really helped me with my love of nature and art and things like that. We used to kill butterflies. I probably wouldn't do that now and make them into pictures and things. But we also had bird feeders and all sorts of stuff. And he really helped me. So you can have a neighbor who actually can be a good resource for you if you feel led and if they're nice folks. All right. Okay. Now we come to the tougher situations. The first one is the grandparent, aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters, good friends, people who maybe are rather antagonistic about homeschooling and who are going to be in your life, and people you don't want to get out of your life. All right. So I'm going to focus on grandparents here, but the same kind of situation would be almost any other people in that situation. People who really don't understand about your homeschooling, they're a little bit antagonistic, and they're not going away anytime soon. They're going to wind up being part of your lives and your kids. All right. The most important, so like I said, I'm going to focus on the grandparents, but all of this really applies to the rest of them too. The good friends, the uncles and aunts, and all that sort of thing. All right. Try very, very, very hard to present a united front with you and your husband, if at all possible. All right. And if it's his parents, it's much better for him to be dealing with them most of the time, especially if it's something that really needs to be dealt with, than you. But sometimes you may be in a situation where you have to deal with your in-laws, and you have to know how to do it. So the first thing you want to understand is that they love your kids. All right. I'm a grandmother now. All right. They love your kids. Any issues they have to do with what you're doing or what choices you're making, not whether or not they love those kids. And the second thing is, especially with grandparents, they're going to be gone someday and you're going to miss them. My in-laws passed away. I missed them. I had a lot of issues at times. My mother's gone. My father was gone many years ago already. But they're all gone now. Old people aren't around forever. So enjoy them while they're there. All right, that's a very, very important thing. All right, now, the other thing is, kids, you still have to have this water off a duck's back thing. Because keep in mind that God says you leave your home and you and a husband and wife are joined together. You're the ones making those decisions. So if you have a situation like I did, my mother-in-law was a public school teacher, my father-in-law a public school professor. At times he was also a private school professor. My mother worked in the public school as a librarian. All right. So we had a lot of that sort of thing going on. But you want to stand together as a family. And again, sometimes you just still, even though it's your own parents you're talking about, you still have to have this water off a duck's back thing where you're listening to them and not letting it get to you. All right. But in this case, of course, you need to have an open dialogue of communication. You can't just be short and snippy with your answers. You need to discuss things like the whole socialization issue, how you're dealing with it, and so forth. And if they're willing to learn, listen to tapes, read books or whatever, of course, that's good for grandparents, but that's not always where they are. And of course, there's some grandparents that are very supportive. I see grandparents often at the curriculum fairs and stuff, so maybe you'll be lucky. When I was doing it, it was pretty early in the movement, and that was not my situation. I was not lucky, and that's. Now, I'll tell you another thing. My in-laws were vocally against it, but my mother acted like she was for it until one time I asked her to contribute to an article that some people were writing about supportive grandparents, and I found out, guess what? She wasn't that supportive. She was just, holding her opinions in, all right? So you never really know about that either. When the kids are with them, keep in mind the children are very resilient, all right? And we were in the situation where we wouldn't be together, and then maybe my kids would go there and spend a week with them. When they did, my mother-in-law, who was a third grade teacher, would always start with a diagnostic test, bring out the basal readers, the workbooks and everything. And of course, it's not what I would have liked. But guess what? My kids actually thought it was kind of fun. It was like playing school when they went to grandmother's house or something. So kids are resilient. Don't worry too much. It's just like when you're talking about you and your spouse. If your spouse and you do things a little differently, don't try to change the way your husband or your wife are doing things. Your kids will figure out that mom does things this way and dad does things this way, in this case. I'm not talking about disciplinary issues. That's totally different, where you want to try to stay on the same page. I'm talking about if a dad thinks you're not teaching him enough spelling and he wants to do spelling bees in the car, something like that. Don't try to stop him. Just the kids will understand that's what he do. If they go to grandma's house and they wind up doing basal readers all day, they're just going to understand that's what we do at grandma's. And again, they're very resilient. Now, I also found it helped a lot when I would involve my father-in-law in some projects. He was a science professor, and so I got him involved in, especially Sam, my oldest son's, his science projects. And we used to always get the roadkill of the week or something sent to us in the mail. And Sam just learned a lot, and he eventually became very much of a scientist. Eventually his degree was in philosophy, but he was in geology for a while before that. So he was very much of a scientist type, and he really benefited by his granddad getting involved. Also, when they wanted to do something, contribute to it, we asked them for a World Book Encyclopedia. And that was one of the best resources that we had, the whole time we were homeschooling. I know people tend not to have real encyclopedias anymore, but I still stand by them, because you don't wind up getting up in the middle of the night and spreading out 18 encyclopedias on the floor and starting to read them all, if it's Wikipedia or something, So I still stand by old-timey, real life world books, even if they're older, that you get from the library. They're really good resource, all right? Over time, the grandparents in my situation came to understand homeschooling and value it more, all right? It took a long time, but over time, they came around quite a bit, all right? I find that you want to try to avoid actually picking fights, but there are times when you have to stand up for something. The thing that I remember the most about this wasn't really a homeschooling issue. It was when my kids would be going over there. My in-laws were at that time in their 80s, and then they didn't want to use seatbelts in their car. They kind of mocked it, and they often treated me as if I was another older kid or something instead of being the mother of these children. And so I remember one time that I had to get rather forceful and say, look, I am the mother of these children, and you are going to use seatbelts in the car, or they will no longer be coming over here when we're not around, So there are times you have to be forceful, you have to pick, but you want to pick those fights carefully, all right? It's not about whether or not you're using basal readers, like I said. That's the kind of water off a duck's back, well, thank you for your input, blah, 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 and keep on going and do exactly what you want to do. My final thing I want to say about grandparents is, when we were in our situation where we lived far away and they would come for 2 weeks at a time, we would go there for a week at a time. Every time they came, we were taking off some time because we wanted to spend it with the grandparents, all right? Even if we did exactly what we did normally, I never wanted them to think they were watching me homeschool, all right? So I always said we'd be taking off, and then we would take time to do family trips and things to the zoo and going to the library and a lot of fun things like that. And maybe a little bit less of what actually was schoolwork than we normally would do. But the bottom line is they were not watching us homeschool. We were taking off 2 weeks to enjoy their company. And I think that was very, very instrumental in us gradually coming to terms with the whole thing. And now, it's already 20 minutes, but this is important. Now I come to the spouse, the reluctant spouse, all right? And this is a tough one, and I recognize it, but I do have a few things to say. First of all, any organization needs one captain, all right? This isn't necessarily even about the biblical, family and all that sort of thing. I'm just saying you have any group of people, any organization needs one person who's ultimately in charge. If that person is your husband, then you don't just run roughshod over him and do it no matter what he thinks. It's just not the right way to do things. And homeschooling is not important enough to destroy a relationship over. All right, so I think that's incredibly important. Now, if your husband, I'm saying husband, but it could work the other way too. All right, in other words, the husband would want to do it and the wife didn't want to. The first thing you want to do is try to determine exactly what the problem is. All right, it might be something specific, like a husband who's afraid that his boys won't get the chance to play sports. All right, or it might be something more systemic and tougher to deal with, like he doesn't think you're capable of homeschooling, especially as the kids get to high school or something like that. It could be the old socialization thing again. It could be that he thinks they won't be ready for college. It will be helpful if you can kind of figure out what those trigger points are so that you know what you're dealing with, all right? And then you need to do your research. You need to look into a lot of stuff. Several things I want to point out. One is NHERI dot, they're saying that they're having trouble playing the video. I'm going to keep trying to go, and if not, I'll redo just this part. I'm going to do this. I'm going to end it here and do another one immediately just about the spouse. That's what I'm going to do.